There is a new scramble to cash in on the ability of forests to absorb carbons. So governments across Africa are mobilizing their populations to plant trees with the hope that they can make money out of it. This money is to be earned through carbon credits, a still largely less understood and controversial concept. This week on the program, we explain what carbon credits are and why more and more African governments are buying into this idea. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Trees and forests cover some 21% of Africa. This is mostly in the Congo Basin, which is home to the world's second largest rainforest after the Amazon. This only accounts for 16% of global forest cover, but the focus to expand the capacity to clean the atmosphere is still on Africa, the lowest emitter at just about 4% globally. Fossil fuels like coal, oil and gas are by far the largest contributor to global climate change, accounting for over 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions and nearly 90% of all carbon dioxide emissions. Carbon credits are one method used by emitters to offset their carbon footprint. The global carbon credit market is valued at around $909 billion. The Africa Carbon Markets Initiative was launched at COP27 in 2022 and aims to support the growth of carbon credit production and create jobs in Africa. Several African nations, including Kenya, Malawi, Gabon, Nigeria and Togo, have announced their commitment to the initiative. And joining me now to explain what carbon credits are and why African governments are rushing to cash in are from Nairobi, 𝗧𝗹𝗿𝗯𝗃, CEO of 𝗡𝗃, a carbon credit marketplace. From Nanyuki in Kenya, Dr. 𝗔𝗂𝗋𝗃, Senior Specialist at Natural State. And with me in studio, Professor 𝗧𝗹𝗿𝗃, President, Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Welcome everyone to the program. Dr. 𝗂𝗋𝗃, let me start off with you here. The carbon markets and carbon credits have generated interest in Africa. To start us off, help us understand what are carbon credits and what is the carbon market?
So carbon markets allow for the trade of a ton of carbon dioxide, which has been emitted somewhere, in exchange for a ton of carbon dioxide that is then stored or avoided being emitted elsewhere. And we have two key markets within the carbon markets: the compliance carbon market, which is set by governments, and a voluntary carbon market, which is what it says. It's voluntary and unregulated. So individuals or organizations can choose to offset their emissions once they've reduced them as best as they can. And the price of a carbon credit varies a lot, from a couple of dollars up to $25 and even higher transactions.
So let me come to you here. How does it work exactly? How many tradable carbon credits equals how many tons of carbon dioxide? Because if you're talking about Africa being an important marketplace here, yet Africa is only like a 4% emitter of pollution.
So the carbon markets are essentially a way of countries that are capable, or countries or corporations or cities that are capable of sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. And the carbon market is a mechanism for those who pollute to be able to offset their hedges and their pollution with those who are sequestrating carbon. And Africa is extremely important, probably the most important part of the puzzle in my view, because it's the largest carbon sink in the world. So this is where the kind of the unfairness of climate consequences are, right? Africa is just 4% of an emission, but yet it faces probably more than its fair share of drought and floods and climate change. And so this is where it's important to look at how this can be rebalanced. And when you talk about the size of the carbon markets, there's really two types of markets. There's the compliance market in the global north. That's about $1 trillion a year now in notional value, dominated by the European ETS mechanism. And then you've got the voluntary carbon market, where Africa fits in best. And this is really around voluntary carbon. And that market was about $300 million a year 3 years ago. It was about $2 billion a year last year. and it's forecast to rise towards about $150 to $200 billion a year in the next 6 to 7 years.
Professor 𝗶𝗶𝗰, I want to hear your view here, because there's been a bit of resistance to the whole issue of carbon markets and carbon credits, particularly for Africa. What's wrong with it?
Well, we have to look at the big picture and the context for this. We have historic polluters in the global north who are responsible for climate change, but continue their emissions. And with carbon credits, they're buying a right to pollute. They're buying a pollution permit, in other words, from a developing country like Kenya, like Liberia. In return, our countries are receiving what I refer to as financial crumbs, which we promptly use to service the debt. So it's not really going towards climate change. In the meanwhile, the historic polluters continue their pollution. We're not actually addressing climate change. We're not reducing emissions. We're giving them the right to greenwash the fact that they're still polluting. And then in the meanwhile, in the global south, in Africa in particular, we're giving away millions of acres of land, sovereignty over our territory, displacing local communities from their ancestral land, from their pastoral land, and allowing for the pollution to continue. What we should be doing as nations of the global south, as Africans, and I'm talking about our governments, is addressing the issue head on, calling out the global north on the fact that they continue their emissions, on the fact that they continue to increase investment in fossil fuel infrastructure at the tune of $500 billion a year as we're facing a climate crisis, instead of phasing out fossil fuels and instead of paying their debt, actual debt, to the global south, that is the climate debt. We have a very simple concept called a carbon budget. We're not allowed to exceed that budget as a globe. And we allocate that budget to different countries based on their size and population and so on. Us in Africa, we have not exceeded our budget. We're way below budget. And the global north has far exceeded its budget and is running into a deficit and is accumulating what we call a climate debt. That climate debt needs to be paid to the countries without any compensation. But instead they say, you're not getting climate reparations, we're not paying for climate debt.
Right. Instead,
we want to have access to your forest, to your land, and we'll pay you financial crumbs, and we will not stop the pollution.
So some have called it a pollutant permit that will only benefit the wealthy, not the climate, and that it makes it easier for the polluter to continue polluting. What are your thoughts?
I mean, not entirely, because emissions are being cut, and obviously it's not being cut fast enough, as we said. But every single year, the polluters in, say, Europe, have to keep coming down with their emissions, and anything that they don't, and if they don't meet that, they have to kind of buy the European ETS, and that costs hundreds of millions of dollars. So I think the mechanism's in place. It's just that it needs to be enforced everywhere in the world. And as the professor quite rightly says, there is a limited carbon budget for the whole world. And right now, there are lots of countries which are going into deficit, and that needs to stop. And if they're in deficit, then that needs to be sort of matched off, shall we say, with the global south. And it could be something as very, very straightforward as a debt for climate swap. So, African countries have accumulated debts over the last decades. But they're sitting on this asset which hasn't been realized yet, which is carbon, and so why not find a mechanism to swap those across? And the Kenyan president has been very vocal about this, and as have others. There shouldn't be a cost or a charge for rebalancing the carbon budget.
Right, Professor 𝗶𝗶𝗰, why not use this resource this mechanism to get the resource, to use this resource and get the money from it?
Well, because that's the whole concept of a debt. When you owe somebody a debt, they don't have to give you anything else for you to pay your debt. But here we're told, we're not going to pay you the debt unless you give us access to your forest, to your land. We're talking about territorial sovereignty here. There's also another problem with this. Most of the carbon credits that Africa is giving to the global north are not going into the compulsory market, where actually the polluters are required in Europe, for example, to reduce their emissions. It's going into the voluntary carbon market, which means companies are just using it as a PR campaign to say we're offsetting our pollution, but we're going to continue pollution. So there is no requirement that they actually reduce it. And there's a fundamental problem. What happens now with the impact of climate change? We're seeing more heat waves and more forest fires. What happens after you've designated a particular forest as a carbon sink and you have a carbon credit attached to it? What happens after 10 years when there's a fire and all that carbon sink is actually released? We're back to square one. We haven't actually offset anything. The polluters continued their pollution, and then the forest fires, because of climate change, because of the emissions that continue, the forest fires now have released all the carbon sink that you've accumulated over the years. So this is not a climate solution. We have to be bold and coherent in our climate policies by demanding that the global north actually phases out and reduces its emissions immediately without us having to give anything in return, space or anything to swap for it. It's a right, it's not charity.
Right, so Dr. Farmer, you've worked on some carbon development projects in Africa. Tell us a bit about this and the benefits to local communities.
There's massive potential for benefits to local communities, but there is a risk of projects not being implemented appropriately as well. And what we really are pushing to see is transparency, is appropriate community engagement in how projects are developed, so that we see real benefit flows to the people on the ground. Because ultimately, projects that are being developed that will store carbon, for example, a tree planting project or a rangeland management project, it's all about behavior change. And that really involves the people on the ground, the land managers, to manage how they're using their land, how they're putting more carbon into the soil or in plants, for example, through tree planting, and that the benefit flows from the sale of the credits, from the carbon stored in those actions, comes back to them.
So there is a lot of potential for Africa in terms of the financials, but when it comes to payments, who and where are the beneficiaries of carbon credit payments? Who are the winners here?
So it really depends on how a project has been set up. Typically, your beneficiaries will be your project developer who's led the development of the project and those participating in the project. But how that is structured really varies from project to project. It's quite costly to set up a carbon project. A lot of investment is needed up front. And so different projects have different financial arrangements and commitments that they take on in how they finance the project up front. So for example, if you have an agroforestry project, it might require a lot of extension services, tree seedlings. And so the project developer takes on that financial risk. And once the carbon payments start coming in, they use those carbon payments to pay off their initial investment. Other projects might deliver payments directly to those participating in the project, and then there might be communal pots that the money goes into and is then distributed from. The money might go directly to households. It really depends on how a project has been structured.
Professor 𝗂𝗂𝗏, of course, many on the continent, if African countries get into the carbon markets and the carbon trading, will be asking, where does this leave Africa's industrialization?
Well, this is the challenge. So we're talking about the climate challenge is an opportunity for economic transformation for the continent. And the reason why many of our governments are unable to invest in climate adaptation is because we have massive external debts that must be paid. And that's why we were willing to accept financial crumbs in the form of carbon markets. But the real source of the debt is a symptom of deeper structural issues, one of which is the fact that we're locked at the bottom of the global value chain. We've been assigned a role that was imposed on us since colonial times, which is either extractive industries with no value added, or assembly line manufacturing, where we have to import the machinery, the fuel to power the factories, the intermediate components to assemble, and even the packaging. And then we use low-cost labor racing to the bottom, competing against each other and staying locked at the bottom of the value chain. No matter how much you double, quadruple your exports, you're always locked at the bottom of the value chain. So our opportunity in this climate challenge is to industrialize, to escape the bottom of the value chain. Why? Because we have all the strategic minerals we need for the high-tech revolution, for the clean energy revolution, for the clean cooking revolution on this continent. We have the market size at scale. which is what you need for industrialization, and we have the complementarity of our resources and capabilities. And we have maybe willing partners in the global north who are willing to transfer technology and help with this transformation. That will be a win on the climate front, and it will be a win on the development front, and a win on the debt front. But unfortunately, we're ignoring all of this, and we're focusing on crumbs that don't produce any transformation and don't address the climate challenge.
All right, so gentlemen, a very interesting discussion there, but we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll continue our discussion on the pros and cons of carbon credits. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Well, still with me are 𝗧𝗹𝗸𝗲, Dr. 𝗔𝗍𝗋, and Professor 𝗧𝗹𝗸𝗲𝗏. Before the break, we looked at what carbon credits are. Let's now examine how they can be used to generate revenue for Africa. Dr. Farmer, let me start off with you here. A new Africa Carbon Markets Initiative, ACMI, was inaugurated last year at COP27. Now, the idea was to support the growth of carbon credit production in Africa, which signaled interest in Africa's carbon markets. Why is there an increasing interest in Africa despite its low emissions?
Well, Africa has huge potential as the continent is developing, green economies, and also around sustainable land management, management of natural resources, and those could be coastal mangroves, they could be rangelands, savannas, forests. There's a huge potential in the continent with its natural resource, and what we really want to see coming out of Africa is the integrity. There's a lot of discussion around protection of indigenous people, communities, livelihoods. And so Africa's really well placed to drive that agenda forward and really push for integrity within the project development process and attract high quality payments for high quality projects.
So what about the regulatory process here?
We're seeing a lot of regulatory action across Africa. Some countries have already put out their regulations around carbon trading, carbon payments. It is bringing some uncertainty to project development on the continent, but I'm optimistic that as these regulations get formalized, that they have the potential to bring stability and to stimulate activity and development in Africa's voluntary carbon market.
So, Professor Kaboub, if I come to you here, the ACMI's ambitions, the ACMI wants to produce some 300 million carbon credits annually by 2030, 1.5 billion credits annually by 2050, and unlock $6 billion in revenue by 2030. Is this feasible?
Of course, and it's unfolding. The indigenous communities don't need carbon markets or anybody from COP to give them the role of custodians of their ancestral land. They've been doing it for thousands of years. They don't need anybody to come in and tell them you have the right to the land. If anything, they're being evicted from their land because of carbon markets. So in terms of the volume of dollars that is potentially coming to Africa, a continent of more than 1 billion people, right? It doesn't represent anything close to the climate debt that is owed, to the financing for development needs, for the structural transformation. It's also incumbent on us as Africans, especially our leaders, to develop a coherent, comprehensive economic vision of transformation, regardless of the climate challenge. If we can just ignore climate change for a second and just focus on the economic deficiencies that we have, and we structure our vision to invest in food sovereignty and agroecology, which is one of the biggest sources of our debt because of our food imports and food dependency. If we focus on developing our biggest potential, which is renewable energy infrastructure, clean cooking infrastructure, that's an industrial policy potential. If we focus on industrialization that allows us to escape the low value added manufacturing trap that we're in, all of those economic policies of long-term transformation happen to be completely consistent with climate change on the food front, on the energy front, on the industrialization front, and that would make whatever carbon markets will bring to Africa seem irrelevant in terms of financial terms and in terms of impact. So I see it as a distraction from the real challenges that our leaders should be focused on. And unfortunately, that's in the interest of the global north. The historic polluters use this mechanism to distract us from the real demands that we are owed from the global north, on the climate front and on the development front.
So, Gum, I want to get your view here. Is this just a distraction? And in terms of a feasibility of the statistics I just gave, is it feasible?
So I think, I do agree with the professor that the long-term solution and mechanism for, or even medium or long-term mechanism is industrialization, development, transfer of technology. But the thing is that, where does the capital come for that? And I think the carbon markets, if used effectively, could be the capital that comes to ignite that change and to make that happen. And so I think they both sit side by side. I don't think it's one or the other, because I think we're looking at different timeframes. We can get, if the northern governments choose to do so, we can get hundreds of billions of dollars to unlock development in Africa and other developing countries globally today, tomorrow, next month, next year. Whereas the process around the development side of it is a multi-generational change, which has to absolutely be done at the same time, but in parallel. I don't believe it's in series or one or the other.
Professor Kaboub here, because you talked about the financing aspect of it, and according to the AU Commission and UN Economic Commission for Africa report, Africa will need at least $2.8 trillion to meet its climate targets by 2030. Can carbon markets be the capital that can be a solution to climate financing?
Since we're talking about trillions, let's put things in context. And the global north claims that they don't have trillions, that they need to rely on the private sector, on market solutions, but governments don't. Governments who have the historic responsibility claim they don't have the money. Let me remind you that 70 years ago, this year we're celebrating 70 years of the London Accords of 1953, which was debt cancellation for Germany. So how did Germany become an economic powerhouse after World War II? Two things. One was the debt cancellation. 50% of Germany's debt was canceled. And let me remind people that African countries actually contributed to Germany's debt relief at the time, including countries like Malawi, including the DRC, Egypt, and beyond. Countries in the global south that are in deep debt distress today. So that was one side of the transformation of Germany. Relieving Germany from debt wasn't enough. The Marshall Plan was an industrialization plan for Germany, to build Germany as an industrial powerhouse on the front lines of the former Soviet Union. The industrialization plans for Germany, which was the Marshall Plan, was a gift from the United States, the equivalent of 5% of US GDP at the time. In today's dollars, this will be $1.2 trillion from the US alone. And that was a very expensive gift that came after a very expensive war that the US financed, which came after a very miserable Great Depression that damaged the US economy for almost a decade. So how can the US afford a Great Depression, a major war, and then a major gift for transformation, for actual transformation, and today claim that there's no money for debt relief, there's no money for economic transformation? So we need to learn our history and recognize that the global north has the financial resources, has the technological capabilities, but doesn't have the political desire to transform the role that Africa plays in the global economy. And the role we've played is very clear during colonial times and post-colonial times, and that's the role that we must reject moving forward. We can't be the place for cheap raw materials anymore. We can't be the place where industrial output is dumped on our markets as big consumers of that output, and we can't be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the global north is delivered to us as development, as job creation, to lock us at the bottom of the global value chain.
Indeed, and I want to get your final thoughts now. Dr. Farmer, let me start off with you. What would you say are the long-term benefits of carbon credits, and when would you say the benefits will be felt on the African continent?
Well, carbon projects require commitment and permanence. They want to see lasting sequestration of carbon, and that also then requires lasting commitment to the project interventions, so to sustainable development, to sustainable livelihoods, poverty eradication. So there's really, really great potential to contribute to Africa's sustainable development goals through the carbon markets, potential to build out green economies within the continent.
Right. So, Professor 𝗂𝗑𝗶𝗰, Africa does need the crumbs to meet some of its, financing, obviously here, given the interest that the continent has entered into the carbon market. So how do you see African countries, though, doing the balance between the economic growth and the carbon market projects?
I think the wrong approach is to do this country by country, which is what Kenya is doing alone, which is what Liberia is doing alone. I think we need an African common position on this. We're not going to be able to reject the crumbs. We're not going to be able to negotiate for debt cancellation or negotiate for actual climate finance in the form of grants rather than loans and additional debt traps if we're doing it country by country. Building a united front is extremely important in negotiations. We've seen this a few days ago at the United Nations when the Africa group led the world, led the global south, in demanding that the international tax system be discussed within a UN system with one country, one vote. And who opposed it? All the European countries, all the OECD countries, because they want to control the international taxation system the same way they control the financial system, the trade system, and investment system. So a common African position can actually win victories like we did at the UN. So can we do this as Africans, as a united voice, or are we going to divide each other and go bilaterally, country by country, beg for crumbs and not get any results? So that is the problem. A British economist a long time ago said, if you owe your bank $5,000 and you don't have it, you have a problem. But if you owe your bank $50 million and you don't have it, your bank has a problem. Your bank has to sit down and negotiate. So how do we get to the $50 million type of bargaining chip? Is by uniting our positions and saying we have a certain set of demands. We will not budge unless you meet us halfway through at least.
Right. So, Gum, you have the final word.
No, absolutely. Look, Africa, I grew up as a young boy in Nigeria, and, we call yourself Nigerian or call yourself African, and Africa really seen more of a brand more than a coalition or like the European Union. And Africa needs to absolutely become like the European Union, because the power when it comes to carbon, it's in its hands. And this is where, there's lots of initiatives at kind of country level or maybe groups of countries, but absolutely not from an African-wide continent perspective. And this is where things need to change. And Africa needs to step up as one, unite and say, look, no, this is the fair mechanism. This is how we want climate for debt swaps. This is how we see financing of this, rebalancing of the carbon bank, for example. And there could be, the UN or the World Bank or the IMF could be the scorekeeper or the balancing, agent for this, just like you have for intergovernmental financing budgets. The same thing for carbon, where they're the balance sheet keepers, the bookkeepers, the treasurers for carbon, and countries get to swap out, borrow, lend against their carbon bank and grow from there.
A very insightful discussion indeed. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to all my guests, Sudu Arumugam, CEO of Zinc, Dr. Jenny Iphamah, Senior Specialist at Natural State, and Professor 𝗧𝗹𝗑𝗶𝗰, President, Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and X, the platform formerly known as Twitter. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. For me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, it's goodbye.